Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving into what is literally the ultimate and honestly most terrifying corporate case study in human history. We're talking about the rise and fall of the British East India Company. And look, this isn't just a dusty history lesson about ancient battles. It's a fascinating look at how commerce, profit, and political power can combine in ways that completely rewrite the map of the world. Let's dive right in. Picture this. You start a company just to make some money from trade. It's the most standard, relatable business venture you can possibly think of, right? The original purpose of the British East India Company was purely commercial. They simply wanted access to the enormously valuable markets of Asia to buy and sell goods. Nothing more, nothing less. And somehow you end up with a literal army. We're talking territories, tax collectors, unimaginable political influence, and absolute control over millions of people. It honestly sounds like the plot of a sci-fi dystopian novel, but this actually happened. The transformation of this trading corporation into a massive imperial power is a shocking reality. And once that transformation began, there was almost no turning back. Now, obviously, this shift from mere merchants to military conquerors didn't happen overnight, but it was anchored by a few absolutely critical moments. Back in 1757, the company won the Battle of Plassey against the Nawab of Bengal, and that gave them enormous political influence in one of the wealthiest regions of the Indian subcontinent. But, influence wasn't enough. By 1764, they fought an even larger coalition, the Nawab of Bengal, the Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal emperor himself at the Battle of Buxar, and the company won again. This led directly to a monumental shift just 1 year later. That crucial pivot point arrived in 1765, when the Mughal emperor granted the company something called Diwani rights. And this is huge. It essentially gave them the authority to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Think about that for a second. They were no longer just buying Indian goods and selling them abroad. They were directly collecting taxes from Indian territory. The entire relationship fundamentally changed from a financial one to a political one. This set off what we can really only call the ultimate corporate flywheel. Step 1. Gain territory. That land then produces massive tax revenue. Step 2. They then took that wealth to fund a sprawling administration and a highly effective army, largely made up of Indian soldiers or sepoys serving under company officers. This military might allow them to expand their influence even further and grab more territory. It was an unstoppable, vicious cycle. A trading corporation was officially behaving like a sovereign state. To keep that flywheel spinning, the company engaged in what were essentially hostile corporate takeovers of Indian states. They used policies like Governor-General Lord Wellesley's Subsidiary Alliance, where Indian rulers traded their foreign policy independence just for British military protection. Later on, under Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, they introduced the doctrine of lapse. Under this policy, if a local ruler died without a recognized natural heir, the company didn't negotiate. They simply annexed the state into their own territory. For local rulers, this was a complete existential threat. So, as you can guess, this created a devastating conflict of interest. On one hand, you've got the company's leaders and shareholders back in Britain expecting sky-high profits and commercial success at all costs. On the other hand, you had the millions of people actually living under their authority. Farmers, artisans, everyday workers, who desperately needed economic stability. These two goals just did not align. The cold, corporate demand for profit was prioritized over the actual well-being of the population. And the human and economic cost here were just staggering. For generations, traditional Indian textiles like cotton and silk were highly valued globally, backed by centuries of specialized artisan knowledge. But under company rule, the massive expansion of British industrial manufacturing completely flooded Indian markets. It disrupted local producers who literally couldn't compete. Wealth that had previously sustained the local economy was now moving through an incredibly unequal colonial structure, extracted straight back to Britain. The consequences were felt by millions of people. By the mid-19th century, society was basically acting like a pressure cooker. Dissatisfaction was bubbling up across every single layer of society. Rulers were terrified of losing their kingdoms to policies like the doctrine of lapse. Indian soldiers within the company's own army were deeply unhappy with military policies. Landowners were facing aggressive political changes, and farmers were just buckling under massive revenue and tax pressures. The resentment was literally everywhere. And all it took was a single spark to ignite that pressure cooker. In 1857, a massive controversy erupted over new rifle cartridges issued to Indian soldiers. It was widely believed that these cartridges were greased with animal fat, which was deeply, deeply offensive to their religious beliefs. This one single issue became the powerful symbol of all the broader distrust and exploitation that had been building up for years. The tension just suddenly exploded. In May of 1857, rebellion broke out among the soldiers in Meerut, and the scale of what followed was monumental. Delhi immediately became this massive center of resistance. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, was raised up as a symbolic figurehead for the rebels. The uprising spread like wildfire to Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi. Incredible, iconic figures like Rani Lakshmi Bai and Nana Sahib emerged to lead the struggle. This wasn't just a local riot. This was the ultimate management crisis for the East India Company, uniting entirely different groups with different grievances into one massive challenge against British power. The fighting was incredibly intense and lasted for months before the British eventually suppressed the uprising. But the consequences permanently changed history. The British government finally realized the East India Company could no longer be trusted to govern an entire subcontinent. So in 1858, Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company's political rule was completely stripped away, and authority was transferred directly to the British Crown. The 2.5-century experiment of corporate rule was officially finished. But this brings us to a really vital realization about the British Raj. It was largely a change in management, not a change in the business model. Yes, the crown took over, they reorganized the army, and they became far more cautious about interfering in local religions. But those extractive colonial economic structures, they stayed exactly the same. India remained deeply connected to the British imperial economy. Even as they expanded railways and telegraph systems, those technological developments were built primarily to serve the administrative, military, and economic purposes of the British Empire itself. Now, the end of company rule definitely did not mean the end of Indian resistance. Over the decades, pushback evolved into a massive, highly organized political movement. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded. And what started as educated Indians demanding gradual political rights slowly shifted into an unyielding demand for absolute self-government. And during the 20th century, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi promoted mass movements based on nonviolent resistance, uniting millions of ordinary Indians, farmers, students, women, workers, to demand their freedom. The stage for the final divestment of this massive empire was set by major global shifts. The First World War significantly changed the political environment, but the Second World War changed it even more. Britain emerged from World War II severely weakened economically. Meanwhile, back in India, the political pressure for independence had grown into an undeniable mass force. It had finally reached a breaking point where it was literally impossible for Britain to ignore anymore. Negotiations intensified, finally culminating in the historic events of 1947. On August 15, 1947, India officially became independent, bringing an end to the long era of British political dominance. But this incredible triumph came with a profound and deeply tragic complication. British India was partitioned into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan. The human impact here was just staggering. Millions of people were displaced, and horrific communal violence caused enormous suffering. The end of colonial rule was a moment of long-awaited freedom, but it was deeply intertwined with profound human tragedy. As we look back at the sheer scale of this history, let's just recap that chilling cyclical logic one more time. The East India Company's journey lasted centuries, but it began simply by looking to make money through trade. That trade necessitated political relationships. Those relationships then required military commitments. Ultimately, that military power led to the control of territory, which created the revenue to finance even greater expansion. Step by step, a simple business mutated into a world-altering power. Which leaves us with this incredibly provocative final question. At what point does a company stop being a business and start becoming an empire? The history of the British East India Company shows us exactly what happens when corporate profit intertwines with politics and military might. Millions of lives were affected, entire economies were completely transformed, and the map of the world was fundamentally changed. Think about the massive corporations operating in our world today and ask yourself, where exactly is the line between opportunity and conquest? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you an entirely new perspective on this incredible piece of history. See you next time.